Fantastic. Okay, well, officially, I'll welcome everybody. My name is Matthew, Partner Development Manager. Obviously, Peter is the star of the show. Peter's going to be taking us through the webinar today. Find the Q&A box, ask those questions, make sure your questions are being answered, or just get your burning questions. What's in your mind about software development, and how can an expert like Peter, who's worked globally in various software projects, from small projects all the way through to multinationals and multi-billion-dollar businesses, and so there's a broad range of experience here. Love to share. He wants to share his expertise. We're going to go through the webinar, but yeah, grab that question Q&A box and ask the questions as we go. Brent's going to be curating the questions and just interjecting as we go. All right, Peter, over to you.
Thank you so much, Matthew. Appreciate it.
My pleasure.
All right, and welcome everybody. Welcome to our webinar. Our intention today is to see if we can leave you just that little bit better off in terms of knowledge about how to drive a successful software project. And really, we're talking about making something on time, on budget, and fit for purpose. But sometimes we get questions about why we bother doing these webinars. And I want to explain that our purpose is to build rapport, trust, to impart some knowledge. And we do, it's true, want an opportunity to work with some of you, not everyone. And at the end of the webinar, I will make an offer in terms of how we might be able to work together. But up until that point, it's all information. And I'll make it very clear when I switch across to putting our offer to you. And in the meantime, let's see if we can answer some of your questions, as Matthew was saying, in terms of how to have a successful software project. All right. So, Matthew also mentioned questions. What I would like to know is, why did you turn up today? What is the big question that you came with in your minds? And I want to make sure that before we close out the webinar, that your question is answered. So if it isn't answered in what I'm talking about through the main part of the presentation, we do have a time at the end for question and answers. And I know Brent is going to be monitoring what they are to make sure that we can answer all those before we finish. So if you've got a big question that you've come here with in mind, please pop it in the chat so that or the Q&A, I think it is, in fact, we've even got, so that we can make sure it's answered. All right. Now, the good news is that software projects, when they fail, they only fail for one of three reasons, or one or more of three possible reasons. Either it's over time, it's over budget, or it's not fit for purpose. So if you can find a way to nail each of those three things, then what you've actually got is a successful software project. Now, here at GistLens, we like to, we are geeks. We do read Slashdot. I don't know if any Slashdot fans are in the audience, but in Slashdot, everyone always tries to deliver a car analogy, and we're not going to fail you here today either. We do have a car analogy for you. If you are missing one of the three key ingredients in terms of how you deliver a software project on time, on budget, or fit for purpose, then what you've actually got is a car that's missing a wheel. And as you can see in the picture, it doesn't drive very well. So there's your car analogy for all the Slashdot fans out there. And that's what we're going to avoid. We're going to make sure we've got a car on our wheel before we try and drive it anyway. Now, this triangle, it may look deceptively simple, but this is the model that we use internally at GistLens in order to have a successful software project. So I'll talk you through it. There are three key parts to delivering a successful software project. One of them is the team. And by team, I'm not just talking about the software development team. I'm also talking about the project management team, the project stakeholders, and of course, the users. So it's everybody involved in that project, even whether they're part of the core team or tangentially involved. That's really what I'm talking about, the teams. Second, we've got systems. So the systems are everything that you've got in place to be able to systemize the process of delivering software. And we'll go into more detail about what that is as we discuss things through the webinar. And finally, technology. So really critical, making sure that you've got the correct technology that you're deploying on the software project. Now, what you can find is that if you get where teams and systems intersect, you end up getting project management. Where systems and technology intersect, you get the ideally correct scoping. And where technology and teams intersect, you get architecture. And if you get the project management right, then you can deliver it on time. If you get the scoping correct, you can deliver the project on budget. And if you get the architecture correct, you can deliver it fit for purpose. So each of those three parts of the triangle is important. If you get any one part of it wrong, or if you make mistakes in one part, it can unbalance the whole thing. And ultimately what you have is just a big bag of problems that isn't going to be software that's doing what you want it to do. All right, now we are going to go into each of those in depth now so that we can understand what I'm actually talking about in terms of these problems and the systems that you can put in place to help at least stack the deck in your favor of delivering a software project on time, on budget, and fit for purpose. First of all, time. What causes software projects to go over time? There are quite a lot of reasons. I'm going to go through some of the top ones. So one of the biggest problems that affects a lot of software projects is too many changes. And ultimately, with the trend of using the agile software methodology, software project methodology, it has led to, how can I put it? A certain laziness in terms of scoping. So people think, hey, it's agile, we don't need to worry about scoping too much. We're just going to roll with it and people can request changes and that'll be fine. While that's true, really what agile is all about is allowing you to get the parts of the software into the hands of users earlier so that you can identify feedback and bring it into the software development process. It's not intended as a way of allowing you not to do any scoping at all. So it's still critical, even if you're using agile, to scope things appropriately so that you don't get too many changes as you're going through the project. Another cause of missing the time targets are interruptions. Now, a good one here, and really the example that I want to highlight is Slack. I would love to get a show of hands, and I know we can't because I can't see you, but a lot of teams either use Slack, or if not Slack, then some other kind of instant messaging, whether it's Teams, whether it's Discord, whatever it happens to be. Instant messaging is ubiquitous. It's all over the place. The problem is that if you've got a software development team that is using some kind of instant messaging and people see these notifications coming up all the time, it pulls the developers out of their focus time, so out of their deep thinking and ability to execute in flow, and they're instead answering messages. And every time you pull a developer out of their deep flow state, it takes them about 20 minutes to reset. And so that's it can very quickly compound, and you end up with very little progress in terms of developer output if you've got constant interruptions from instant messaging. So you might be wondering, okay, well, what can we do about something like that? What I would recommend is, if you're going to use, and almost everyone does, instant messaging, two things. One, if the developers are remote, and a lot of the teams are remote these days, you need to encourage a culture where it's okay for people not to immediately answer any questions that come along on instant messaging. Because I can tell you that remote teams, and remote developers in particular, they feel a pressure to answer those questions immediately, because they feel like if they don't answer it immediately, people are going to assume they're not working. It just seems to be what happens. So if you've got a culture where it's okay for developers not to answer things immediately, that's a good step in the right direction. Second, the developers actually have to turn off those instant messages in order to get their work done. Now, there is an extension you can get called the Pomodoro timer, which will, the developers can hit that, and for 20 minutes, they won't get any notifications. That can be a way forward. And then after the 20 minutes, then any notifications that had come up in the meantime, they get notified about, and then they can answer. I've seen that work successfully for some people, and that could be a way forward. So aside from interruptions, I want to briefly talk about blockages. Now, blockages are anything that is prohibiting easy momentum of the team. I have seen that from the perspective of technical blockages, I'll give you an example. So when working in a highly confidential environment, there are certain constraints on who can access databases and where they can be accessed from. And I was working with a team that had a 40-minute build and test cycle. So typically developers, when they're developing, they want to have a very quick feedback. So they want to be able to code something, they want to build it, and they want to see the effect immediately. And the tighter that you can get that loop, the faster the developers will be able to get through their work, and ultimately the faster they'll be able to develop things. If that loop gets too long, and 40 minutes is crazy, that's a very long time, that means that a developer has to wait 40 minutes to get some kind of feedback from the system that they're trying to build. Then instead of something taking 2 hours, it'll take 20 hours, and all of a sudden you've got a big time blowout. So blockages, it's important to remove them. Missing dependencies. So often what you'll find is that people will, or potentially project managers may not have the assets that the development team need in order to perform some of their duties, some of their work. So dependencies, and having an inefficient code base or architecture. Now, that's not always something that you can prevent or do something about, particularly if you've inherited a code base. But if you know that you are working with a code base that happens to have a lot of technical debt, or it's quite inefficient to work in, then it's really good to factor that in terms of expected timeframes up front, rather than discover that later on. And speaking of technical debt, that would be the last thing that is one of the things that can cause the development team to take a lot longer than they otherwise would. And by technical debt, really what I'm talking about is the tendency over time of a code base to collect, as a code base grows and evolves and more software or features are added to that code base, the effort required to make changes increases. And that tendency to increase in terms of effort of making those changes is what we call technical debt. So, and that can sometimes be something that we can do something about, and sometimes not as much. But nonetheless, that's one of the reasons. So you may be wondering, okay, well, what can we do about all of these things? Well, if we have the right team and the right systems in place, then ultimately where they intersect, if you remember back to the triangle, that was in project management. So project managers, a good project manager is seriously worth their weight in gold. They will keep that project, changes constrained. They can remove blockages. They can obviously keep everyone informed and reporting, which is what people typically think of in terms of project management. And through that work that they're doing, allow the development team to do their job, which is ultimately to deliver on functionality and in terms of the software project. So time, that's one of the 3 key parts. Moving on, budget. So the biggest reason that budgets go over is inadequate scoping at the beginning of the project. Now, the scoping exercise, as we were talking about sort of before, earlier when we were at the triangle, is something that you can't skip, even if you're going with an agile project. What I have seen happen on several occasions are projects where you get a particular scope or a particular understanding at the beginning of the project that includes a particular scope, but not enough thought has gone into that scope, how the software needs to be used, how it needs to fulfill the requirements that it needs to fulfill. And consequently, at the start of the project, the development team may say, well, okay, with our understanding of this particular set of functional requirements, we believe it's going to take, 7 to 9 sprints. And that's fine, but those functional requirements was only a part of the puzzle. And over time, when more information becomes available, suddenly it's not 7 to 9 sprints, it's more like 12 to 13, or it's more 17 to 19. So it kind of just grows and grows. The more you can gather in terms of the requirements for the system up front, the more realistic the timeline and ultimately the budget can be established at the beginning. It's really that simple. missing functional requirements can lead to rewrites, it can lead to changes. And of course, if you've ever talked to a software developer about scope changes, you will have heard the term scope creep, which is really where we want, more and more and more all the time, more functionality. So a creep of the scope. The other things that can lead to, budget overruns will be things like the wrong project methodology. And really that comes back to the scoping discussion that we've just been talking about. There are predominantly two approaches to project methodology. We've already talked briefly about Agile. I would love to know, in fact, if you want to just drop in the chat, do you know what I'm talking about when I say Agile? Because if no one knows what I'm talking about with Agile, then I should probably define that for you first. Does anyone not know? Anyone not know the difference between Agile and Waterfall? Because I can give you a 30-second rundown of what that is. No? Everyone knows? Either everyone knows or everyone has dropped off and isn't actually here anymore. Okay, all right. Thanks, Damo. I can see if you know what Agile Waterfall are. Okay, excellent. So given that we don't have anyone else contributing to the chat just at this point in time, I'm going to assume that everyone knows, in which case I'll just mention that one of the reasons that the budget can not be appropriate is choosing the wrong methodology. And the one key thing I'd like to highlight about Waterfall, even whether you know or not, I'd just like to draw your attention to it, is that if a new requirement comes up when executing a Waterfall project, you actually have to go right back to the scoping stage, like to the requirements analysis stage of the project, and effectively start again. So any changed scope in a Waterfall while you're already executing it will trigger a rescope, which is suboptimal. Chat is disabled. Okay, all right, chat is disabled. Maybe that's something Brent can do something about, but nonetheless, in the meantime, we'll go with the Q&A. So thanks for letting us know, David. All right. The example I'd like to give in terms of budget and how this can go very badly wrong was quite some time ago, fairly earlier in my career. I worked for a bank. It was the Royal Bank of Scotland, and they had acquired three payment service providers, but the two big ones were WorldPay and Bibbit. And I actually worked for Bibbit at the time, which was one of the leading payment service providers back in, when was that? That was a very long time ago. So early 2000s, some time ago. Nonetheless, they had an integration exercise to be able to, take these payment service providers and kind of squish them together. And what ended up happening was the project, when I left, was 3 years late and 100 million euros over budget. So the main reason and the main cause for that budget overrun, obviously time and budget are linked because a lot of that budget ends up being spent on time. But if you are, the reason for that overrun in this particular case was predominantly problems with the scoping exercise. So even big banks can get it wrong, is probably the best way to put that. But yeah, it can go seriously wrong. And you'll notice the same thing on a lot of government projects. They tend to get the scoping consistently incorrect, which is amazing. I will, in their defense, what I will say is that when you've got a very large project like that, it can be quite difficult to scope. So it's not necessarily an easy or trivial exercise, but nonetheless a critical one. All right, so fit for purpose. Predominantly where this goes wrong is in one of two places, either not correctly capturing the technical requirements for the software. And by technical requirements, I'm talking about things like performance, what kind of performance is required for this site? What kind of scalability does it need to have? Now, if it's an internal business application, then scalability is likely not a concern. But if it's a consumer-facing external application, then it will absolutely be of concern if you're intending to get any kind of scale. Security, what are the security requirements? I've worked on some projects where really security hasn't been a great deal of a concern. and others, like for a bank, for example, or some manufacturing systems that have very highly confidential information, then security is extremely tight, and it becomes one of the most critical parts of the overall project. And finally, of course, well, not finally, that there are more, but maintainability is another one that is critical to get right. I have seen some exquisitely engineered software that is actually quite hard to maintain because it hasn't been factored in when doing the technical requirements gathering. Aside from the technical requirements, it's also the not capturing the human requirements. So that's things like change management, it's things like usability. I don't know if any of you have ever seen a user interface that's been developed by a software engineer, but it tends to be quite logical for the software engineer, but not necessarily logical for everybody else. So I've seen, I have seen projects go wrong simply because the users couldn't figure out how to use it because no one had bothered consulting the users, and the software engineer didn't have enough direction or input, and consequently designed something that they thought worked great, even though perhaps no one else could understand what to do. So in terms of an example I'd like to briefly discuss in terms of fit for purpose, or at least something to float and suggest considering, is a minimum viable product and the concept of a minimum viable product. First of all, MVP, minimum viable product, the concept behind it is to put in the minimum amount of effort to be able to validate some kind of idea. Now, if it's a product that you're trying to develop, then that ends up being a critical piece of information to know whether or not you need to continue developing that product, or whether, if you decide actually, or discover that there isn't a product market fit, then to just basically abandon that project because it's not going to commercially work. In some cases, an MVP may not be appropriate because you already have validated the product market fit, or it may be an internal tool, in which case it's less about product market fit and making sure that you design something that the internal team that is going to use it actually needs. Nonetheless, if you use an MVP in order to validate a concept, it can be a reassuring way of making sure that you're going in the right direction and that the software that you're developing is definitely fit for purpose, by virtue of the fact that the market will actually pay for the product that you're trying to develop, plus MVP. Ultimately, if you get the correct technology and the correct teams, it leads to an architecture that factors in all of the technical requirements and also the human requirements of the system. And ultimately, what that leads to is software that is fit for purpose. And that's what we want, fit for purpose. Now, before I go on to the next section, which is going to be about a case study, I'm interested to know, and given that it looks like the chat has come alive, so that's helpful. I'm interested to know how, like on a scale of 1 to 10, how closely you feel. Okay, if 10 is absolutely, yep, I know exactly how to get a software project on time, on budget, and fit for purpose, put a 10 in the chat. And if it's on the other end of the scale, it's like I've actually got no idea how to do this, then put a 0. I'm just curious how we're tracking from 0 to 10. And if you're thinking, 7, okay, yeah, good, nice. Okay, 7's actually good. Software projects, by the way, while everyone else is thinking of what they would like to enter in terms of a number, are notorious for being difficult to bring or to make them successful. So ultimately, that means on time, on budget, and fit for purpose. And you'll hear a lot of people talk about software projects having such a low chance of success. And it's true that a lot of them don't. And I think, I'm not sure what the latest stats are. I've heard, depending upon different sources, different statistics in the past, everything ranging from about 50% that fail up to about 80 or 85% that fail. And what they might be talking, well, what they are talking about is that it's either gone over time, over budget, or it wasn't fit for purpose at the end. It doesn't necessarily mean that no software was developed at the end of it, although sometimes it does get, like, the projects get cancelled, and therefore, you know, something goes over time by, you know, years and years, and ultimately they can, and it never gets produced. That happens a lot on government projects. But yeah, just because people say, hey, 80% of them fail, doesn't necessarily mean that 80% of them don't finish. But some of them don't. And yeah, nonetheless. Okay, we've only got a 7. Okay, so I'm going to take that as the answer for the entire group then. So we'll go for a 7. Okay, noted. What I'd like to talk about next then is a case study. This is one that I was personally involved with. It was for a shift crewing application. The intention of this application was to put up on the board at a factory site a number of stations or positions that could be staffed on the factory floor. And it would be something, a board that people could consult when they were coming onto their shift. They'd be able to look up at the board and say, oh, okay, all right, I see I'm on that station today. And they can go there and do their job. Now, in order to put the crew members on a particular location, it needed to ensure that they had the appropriate training, that they had appropriate supervision if they weren't fully trained, and also factor in their cross-skilling. So the intention was to create a robust workforce that would be able to handle fluctuations in the availability of different key staff for that factory. In order to do it, a developer was, in fact, a couple of developers were tasked with the objective of getting this software to work. They'd been working for quite some time, so months. They'd been working on this challenge, and they kept on reporting that, yes, we're almost there. We're almost there. And this, you know, we're almost there. It's just about done. We're almost there. Went on for week after week after week after week. Months passed, and eventually the developer said, it can't be done. It's impossible. Now, at that point, the project manager that was in charge of the project completely freaked out and went into, you know, panic mode and tried to come up with some kind of solution. In trying to come up with a solution, he reached out, in that case, to me and said, hey, we've got this situation. Can you please come and take a look at this? I'd just like to have a second opinion. So, okay, all right. Went, took a look. And in the end, I had to agree that it was impossible the way that they were trying to do it, but it was still possible to do it a slightly different way. We got a proof of concept working. Well, we got a direction that same day, but there were some difficulties implementing it with the development team. And ultimately, we were brought on to implement the way that we could get it done. And it took us about a week in the end to do it, but it did involve a fairly substantial, after an assessment of what was actually going on, a fairly substantial rewrite to parts of the software. In the end, they did get their software project. It was actually within time and budget, but only because it was rescued. So having a think about our triangle and the 3 critical parts of how you deliver software on time, on budget, and fit for purpose, what went wrong? First of all, the team. So there was no communication. There was no awareness from the project manager that something was actually going wrong. He was just taking it face value that, no, okay, they're telling me it's almost done. And the developers were saying it's almost done. We've just about got it working. There was no reporting of information. there was no demonstrations. There was no moment when the project manager said, okay, right, demonstrate for me what you've got. And because that pattern persisted over a period of time, it led to that, ultimately that situation where the project had well and truly gone off the rails by that point. Now, there's also an issue to do with the architecture. So when the team and the technology came together, what they had was a system that wasn't performant. So one of the critical failures of what the development team had done at that point was a performance issue. So it was so poorly performing that it simply couldn't render what it was attempting to render. Ultimately, the problem was the way that it was being architected on the front end. And the solution was, as I mentioned before, ultimately, we had to rewrite substantial parts of it. But you can see, even in, and this was not a small company either. It was quite a large company, and the staff involved were not inexperienced. So this was a fairly senior project manager that was involved in the project, and developers that at least had experience, but they the way that it was handled, the way that it was done, you know, the team plus the systems and the team plus the technology didn't quite get it right. And the project, even though they didn't know it at the beginning, was like that car that didn't have all four wheels. It only had three wheels, and it was creating sparks flying down the road, creating a lot of damage to the car and the road without necessarily being aware of it. And I think perhaps that's that lack of awareness is one of the main problems that happened in that particular case. But in the end, the project manager did wake up to the situation. He did do the right thing in the sense that he like I said, he went into full on we have to fix this right now mode, and pulled alarm bells and managed to get it working by getting some extra help onto the team and sorting it out. So it has a happy ending, but it could very easily have had a very sad ending, particularly for that project manager. It was close, very close. All right. Q&A. Brent, this might be the point where you want to come off mute. I know you're on mute. And what do we have?
Yeah, there's a question in the Q&A from earlier on from Damien. So how to tackle challenges towards the end of a project that can really derail time and sign off?
Okay, yep. So, and because I know Damien, Damien, are you happy to come off mute and maybe we have a bit of a chat about it?
Yes, hello, how are you going, Peter?
Hey, I'm good, thanks. How are you doing?
Very well, very well. Yeah, it's definitely a challenge we have here at our office, where projects tend to have some last minute changes that really come in there when you weren't expecting it, typically by someone who wasn't originally part of the project. They've now come on board later. I'm talking like a stakeholder here, for example. And they've now gone, well, what about this? Let's add that to it. And by the way, that needs to be included. I'm just going to put the hammer down and want to include these extra features that are really going to break things right at the end. How would you tackle those situations?
Yeah, I do have an answer to this. There are only two ways to approach it, that I've found. One is to simply say no and say, well, it depends upon the what's the word I'm looking for? It depends upon the remit of what the software team has to do in order to get a successful sign-off. Now, if the new things that this person that's come late to the project has started asking for are actual requirements versus nice to haves, like if they're requirements to be able to sign it off, then I would definitely be asking how could it get through so late to the project without those being known as requirements. At the end of the day, it's either going to be, yes, they are definitely required. We didn't catch them before. Okay, that's fine. We know them now. Good. We now need to go into a phase of renegotiation for delivery, because you can't just add new requirements at the end without having some kind of impact to the time and the budget of the project. The risk is that what was missing, so the required functionality, without it, the project may not be fit for purpose. And if that's the case, then yes, they are needed. But as I say, that's when it would trigger a renegotiation of the time and the budget. If the features that are being asked for, hey, we need X, Y, and Z. Well, if X, Y, and Z aren't actually requirements and that they're nice to haves, then they could be handled as CRP, so continuous improvement. In which case, ultimately, after the project is signed off, declared successful, everyone cracks open the champagne and celebrates, and then goes into a continuous improvement program. And if it can go, say, on the backlog for that point and to improve in the future, then that's a slightly different conversation. And that's more about, excellent that we've captured this. That's really good. We're going to keep the original scope, and we're going to add all of these suggestions and ideas for delivery later as part of CIP. Has that helped at all?
That does help. Thank you very much. It is more on, I guess, gives me an idea. I need to focus on the features more than the personality of the person coming through.
Right. Okay. Yes. Definitely. Definitely focus on the features. Yes. And I'm reading into that, and I probably shouldn't, but I've also had people join projects where the personality can be very strong and very strong opinions, and sometimes demands. But if at the end of the day, it depends upon the organization as well, but the stakeholders who are going to be signing off on the project would be the ones that would ultimately need to decide whether the new features being requested by that person are things that they are willing to allow the project to have a renegotiation of that time and budget to accommodate. And if the stakeholders say, actually, you know what, I want it at this date, or I want it within this budget, then the reality is they're going to have to accept that, well, these requirements came along late. They were not part of the original scope or that we'd agreed, and therefore there's no option but to go with CIP and to do it later. But yeah, okay. Thank you for the question. That was good. Good question. What do we have next?
That's all the questions we have so far, but if anyone else wants to ask one, they can post one in the Q&A or into the webinar chat, and then I can bring them, or if they want to ask it live, just send an indicator to me and I'll take them off mute.
And if you want to stay on mute, that's also fine.
Yeah.
We can probably get just in case that that question has caused everyone else to not be happy to ask a question. I won't pull you off mute unless you're happy with it. And I just had a sneaking suspicion that Damien would be happy to have a chat. We are coming to the part of the webinar where I know some people have come here for information. And if that's you, thank you so much for coming along. I appreciate your time, appreciate that you've come along and shared this webinar with us. And I hope you got what you were looking for when you came along to the webinar. And thank you for your time, as I say, and you're welcome now to disconnect. because the next part that we're going to be talking about is for people who, instead of information, are potentially looking for implementation. And if that's you and you're looking for some assistance with some kind of software project, then if you stay on the call for another 5 minutes, then we can, well, basically we'll explain how we can potentially work together. So yeah, for those of you departing now, thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of the day. I know it's, I think it must be coming up to 11 o'clock, quarter to 11, I think, in Australia, East Coast anyway. Enjoy the rest of the day. And for those that stick around, we'll have a chat about implementation. All right. So I'm going to assume at this point that everyone still on the call is potentially interested in implementation. So allow me to go to the next screen. The next step. We are interested in working with people. We have a limited bandwidth, so there's only a certain number of teams that we have in GistLens and a certain number of software projects that we can run at any particular point in time. We, however, would be interested to talk to anybody who has an idea for a software project or is looking for some assistance in terms of implementation. And what we have is something called a strategy session. It's with Matthew, who opened the webinar with us today. He's our partnership development manager. And on that call, we get an understanding of what it is you're trying to achieve, why you're trying to achieve it, and start going into some of the details about potentially how we could deliver what it is that you're trying to achieve. Depending upon how that call develops, it may end up discussing feature sets, or it may just simply end up discussing what it is that ultimately, what it is you're trying to do, what you're trying to achieve. There is I think, Brent, have you got a link that you're able to share? Ah, there we go. Brent has just put a link to Matthew's Calendly in the chat. And if you follow that link, you'll be able to find a time in his calendar to have a strategy session from where we can discuss how we may be able to work together. And with that, I will simply ask if there are any questions, please either drop them in the chat now, or because the chat is open, I think, or alternatively, the Q&A part, Q&A window. All right, Matthew, potentially back to you for closing comments.
Thanks very much, Peter. Thank you for that. My video is actually disabled, but people know what I look like. So if anybody does want to have a conversation with me about what you're actually trying to achieve, I'd love to book that time in over the next couple of days. I just had a look at the Q&A box, and then people are hanging around just to understand what's all going on here. So thanks very much for that great session there. I really appreciate it, and I'm sure everybody else does here as well. And I'm looking forward to speaking to anybody that does want to engage and really get some, some fuel, some rocket fuel into your software projects. That's all from me. Thanks, Peter.
Okay, all right. And thanks, everybody. Enjoy the rest of the day.
Bye for now.
Okay, bye for now. Cheers.